Okay, here's an example of a poll that I took off of the internet. The first thing I want you to realize is that this was just one or two questions of a whole series of questions that were asked. Okay, and the first thing you want to notice here is that right down here it tells us who conducted the poll, and it was conducted by the New York Times. And usually the New York Times is going to conduct some pretty good polls, unless you happen to be a person who is extremely conservative and you may believe that the New York Times is somewhat liberal, which they are. So when we're going into this poll, we have to realize that the New York Times could actually be letting their liberal bias come out here. Okay? So keep that in mind. But from reading most of what you find in the New York Times, they're usually pretty accurate, because the New York Times will usually allow you to have a link or access to the actual process by which they've asked the questions. And if you were to look at this poll online, a lot of times where it says New York Times right here, you would be able to click on that and it'll take you to a web page that explains the exact process by which this poll was conducted. Okay? Something else you want to look at when you look at this poll, is right here we're looking at very clearly the margin of error. I made that margin of error up because the margin of error in this poll was someplace else on the screen capture, and I couldn't put it in there. So I made up that margin of error. Okay? But a 3% margin of error is a pretty good margin of error. Okay? So what we would do is take this 3% margin of error and applying it to these questions. Basically what they said was, do you think the government would do a better job or worse job than private insurance companies in providing medical coverage? These bar graphs here, these bars here, tell you how the sample believed, and we apply that to the whole population. So basically what we're saying is, now what they're saying is 50% think the government would do a better job, 34% worse, 2% the same, and 14% have no opinion. So basically with this margin of error, we're saying this 50% here could be as high as 53 and as low as 47. 34 could be as high as 37 or as low as 31. The same it's within the margin of error, so we can just about throw those responses out. And then people had no opinion on it could be as high as 17 or as low as 11. Okay? So that's how the margin of error works. Okay? Looking at this poll also, we can look in here and we can find out what the method of this poll was. How was the poll conducted? It says here it was based on a nationwide telephone poll. And usually using a telephone to pick your sample is going to be considered an appropriate way of doing it today. Because even though everybody's name's not listed in the phone book, these companies that conduct telephone polls, they don't go to the phone book. They have computer programs that randomly generate telephone numbers. And it randomly generates a telephone number. So if you own a telephone, whether you're listed in the phone book or not, you have an equal chance of being selected. The sample would be considered random there, because while everybody in the United States doesn't have a telephone, it's close enough to everybody in the United States having a telephone that they would consider that to be a truly random sample. Okay? And it also tells you when the poll was conducted, from June 12th to June 16th. And then the last thing here that we see in this poll is that it tells us what the population and the sample is. Okay? The sample here are 895 adults. So basically, by seeing that 895 adults was the sample, we're going to have to assume that the New York Times conducted a valid poll. So the population would be all adults in the United States. So this is going to measure, these results should measure how all adults in the United States feel. And if you look at this, there was only 895 adults asked the question. Yet, this poll is probably going to be considered a valid poll, which means it's measuring what it wants to. There's not a huge sample there. But if you use the proper scientific and mathematical processes, then that relatively small sample size isn't going to be a problem.